Today, we are delighted to have with us Mark Findlay, Professor of Law at Singapore Management University and Director of its Center for AI and Data Governance, where he's a professional research fellow. He's here to talk about Kampong ethics and life space storytelling, trusting AI. Let me say a few more words about our distinguished guest speaker. Mark Findlay has honorary chairs at the Australian National University, the University of Edinburgh, and the University of New South Wales, as well as being an honorary senior research fellow at the British Institute for International and Comparative Law and an honorary fellow of the Law School of University of Edinburgh. He is the author of 29 monographs and collections and has written over 150 articles and book chapters. He has held chairs in Australia, Hong Kong, Singapore, England, and Ireland. He was at the University of Sydney for over 20 years as the chair in criminal justice and director of the Institute of Criminology. Mark is also a founding member of the Global AI Ethics Consortium, which's aim is to move out of the general and abstract theories on AI ethics towards more concrete and tangible frameworks and guidelines for concrete AI systems. So for applying AI ethics in a way that is technically feasible and globally minded. And last but not least, Mark is also one of the instructors of our AI Global Perspectives course, which is free to take online, and I invite you all to do it. We encourage you to watch his lecture, Ethical Surveillance, Regulating for Personal and Surveillance Data in COVID Control Conditions. Before we begin now, I would like to ask you to turn off your microphone and camera during the session and submit your questions via chat or raise your hand. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Also, let us know in the chat if you are experiencing difficulties of technical nature or otherwise. Mark, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christoph. I'll share my screen if I can. Okay.
Yes.
We can see that?
We can see it, yeah.
Good, excellent. Okay. What I want to talk about today is a complex collection of ideas, which I'm hoping that I'll be able to draw together for you in an interesting way so that you'll come away from the exercise with some new ideas and some new perspectives. Kampong ethics and storytelling and the notion of safe digital spaces. Seems quite a sort of left field series of ideas, but not so. And it grows largely from three areas of research that we have been working on in the center. One is our work on the AI Ethics Hub. The second is the work that we've been doing on trust. And the third now is looking at storytelling, safe digital spaces, and smart cities. So I'm going to try and combine these together today to give you a flavor of how these different themes work together. All right. Presentation's purpose. Why storytelling in safe digital spaces? Well, stories embody ethical priorities. Stories are about community life experiences, and they arise from safe spaces where people bond together to tell stories and to share gossip. What's wrong with the top-down approach to ethics? I'll touch on that very quickly, then move to why community-grounded ethics is important, decisions that generate and sustain trust. I'll talk briefly about trust bonds as community, AI in relationships of trust, and passing reference to AI and ethics being more than ethics about technology. And then ethics attribution and distribution, I'll talk about very briefly, some of the blockages and blind spots in the pipeline across the AI ethics ecosystem, and then move to Kampong, the Kampong spirit, Kampong ethics, and talk a little bit about community voices. And then finally, I want to get an idea about ethics, which is more than just simply safety and reducing risk, more than smiley faces on robots. but that ethics can be taken beyond the lab and into the deployment arena in communities. So why talk of storytelling in safe digital spaces? Partly because I asked the question, what's missing in the present AI ethics discourse? One thing that's missing is voices from other cultures and global experiences. AI ethics does not have to be just about individualist, libertarian, rights-based concepts and contexts, but in our part of the world, it's a much more communitarian notion when you're dealing with ideas of trust, fairness, equity. Also, we need to have shared appreciations and understandings of what ethics may be, not just a top-down exercise, but across the main decision sites in the ecosystems that AI relies on. And we've done a lot of work trying to understand how different individuals in those ecosystems understand ethics in different ways. Then we want to consider attribution and distribution. Whose responsibility is it for ethical decisions to be made? Then the need to resonate with experiences of those lower in the organizational power hierarchy, the people on the front line, the millennials who are developing the new tech, who are involved in the startups, innovation. What does ethics mean to them? We want to talk a little bit in a less paternalistic way, a more communitarian way, and to think about concepts like mutual fairness as driving the reality of ethics as we see it. And then finally, I want to take a realist approach. What can ethics regulate and what can it not? During the pandemic, it became clear in many ways that ethics on its own is not the regulatory force that will answer all questions and deal with all problems. And in the work that we're doing, interestingly, with TUM and with Bickel on the relationship between ethics and rule of law, we're asking questions about, can concepts of enforcement and institutional structure add to ethical frameworks in a constructive way? All right, the Singapore top-down approach, I'll touch upon this very briefly. Singapore is interested in allowing technologies to develop while protecting consumer trust. Trust is a big feature of the model framework. There's an advisory council, there's the model AI governance framework, and there's research fields and areas such as ours. Secondly, the guiding principles guiding who? The model AI governance framework is a decision-making process which talks about explainability, transparency, fairness, very common concepts that you'll find across the AI language. And it's also looking at AI systems and solutions. The model framework portends to be human-centric and focuses very heavily on concepts of safety and risk reduction. And then finally, the idea is that the model governance framework will be a voluntary compliance arrangement where corporate sectors, those involved in the operations of AI, and consumers will come together to generate a governance tapestry which will draw those different stakeholders together in a productive frame. Now, the model governance framework is a top-down structure, as I said to you before, and it's had some success, but it's also faced some difficulties in actually reaching the levels of impact that perhaps we'd expect of ethics at all phases of the production pipeline. So, back to storytelling in safe digital spaces. Storytelling is not just random positioning and a flow of life space experience. Stories reveal more than knowledge co-production and moral cohesion. They indicate ethical predisposition, preferences, and valuing. Now, on this point, the storytelling research that we're doing is to look at sustainable smart cities and where social infrastructure rather than technological or data infrastructure should be a priority. And within that is the importance of neighborhoods. Within that, the importance of stories. Within that, the importance of ethics to drive the way that decisions are made about the relationship between AI and humans in community. Secondly, stories grow out of emotional arcs. And we've done some work recently on the relationship between emotions, decisions about ethics, and trust. What emotions drive decisions for people to be ethical or not? And when those decisions are made, where does it take the trust that needs to underpin the AI relationship in community? Stories and storytelling, it's about characters in stories revealing how trust bonds are built and broken. Ethics influences trusted decision-making and their relationships. Just on this point, it's important to remember that our concept of community is very similar to that of Roger Cotterill, the sociology of law professor from the UK, who says that communities are not things or places or times, but rather they are relationships and bonds of trust. To develop those relationships of bonds of trust within which AI can play a part, we need safe digital spaces. And in those safe digital spaces, we need stories to be able to be made and told where characters trust and distrust, and AI is positioned to influence social infrastructure. I'll mention very briefly how towards the end of the presentation. Safe digital community spaces relies on AI as a participant within communities and very heavily on open ethical data sharing. If you're interested in this concept, you might go to our website and have a look at our work on digital self-determination, which talks a lot about the role of the data subject in being able to manage open ethical data sharing. Okay, why is community-grounded ethics important for AI and data governance? Because community responsibility for positioning, prioritizing, and policing ethics should be recalled. It's about communities having the watch over how ethics produces the outcomes we need and what we are looking for. Ethical challenges arise in the black box systems that we've talked about in terms of algorithms and the unexplained software and maths behind AI. Also discriminatory predictions, outcomes, bias, and what entities are using AI, who should not, and how should AI be constrained so that the outcomes are positive and for social good. I think more importantly are the data-related challenges. Who, data ownership is a big discussion, something that we in the Centre are really trying to move away from, talk much more about data access than ownership. What types of data are collected? When is this collection happening and why? And how are modes of data collection instituted and created? This is an important question to ask when we move out of the pandemic control phase and into a situation where we are said to live with the pandemic in our day-to-day existence. We've been very heavily influenced by tracing and tracking technology, safe entry technology. Will this disappear when we move away from an emphasis on control? I strongly doubt it. And so the question then for those who are interested in ethics and interested in the governance of data, governance of AI, will we live in surveillance societies ongoing, or what will be the future in respect of that concern? The proposed solution that we put forward is trustworthy AI in communities. Ethical decisions in design and deployment built and bond in trust. So trustworthy AI to regulate data more than the machine. We're not taken by the concept of trustworthy technology. Machines can't be trusted. Rather, it's those who make them and those who feed data into them. Trust that builds the foundation of society, economies, and sustainable development. We're engaged currently in looking at the relationship between AI and the SDGs to see whether in fact there is a genuine socially positive relationship between technology and social development. And this comes back to questions about trust within communities. If you look at the EU 7 ethical guidelines, human agency and oversight, we believe in informed data subjects, technological robustness, trust, not certification is our argument, privacy and data governance. What becomes so much more important in questions of privacy is data integrity and the position of the data subject in managing their data. Transparency, AI-assisted information looping allows for this so that people know where their data is, how it's being used, diversity, non-discrimination and fairness, societal and environmental well-being. We put sustainability right in the middle of that concern, that if markets, social arrangements, environments are not sustainable and AI is part of that problem, then we have serious concerns. The UN climate change conference currently going on at present has not spent a great amount of time, as I see it, on the role of AI, or in fact the challenges posed by AI technology when it comes to global warming, and these are issues that we need to think about. Finally, accountability, responsible decision-making, who makes that decision and how. So more than trustworthy technology, trust is a relationship and not a machine, we would argue. AI and community, governance by people in communities where AI is part of social bonding. This is such a common sense concept, and yet whenever we raise it, many people are surprised by the idea that we would locate AI in communities and see them as part of trusted relationships. If you have AI in community in part of trusted relationships, then the whole discussion about human-centric AI or humans in the loop becomes a waste of time, because in fact humans are never out. Humans never leave the community. The question is not so much where do we put the human, but where do we put the AI, and how does AI, if ethically driven, become a force for trust? AI can be created and deployed within the intention of participating communities in trusted social bonds, which means that the community must have a role in determining the priorities and principles for AI. Our communitarian AI research has said that a preferred interpretation of ethics is around the idea of creation, deployment, and the way in which ethics becomes part of the trust relationship. Our research clarifies the functions and positioning of AI, and it reveals the process whereby ethics and AI existing in communities to strengthen bonds of trust dependent on activity and dynamic human relationships. Ethics, attribution and distribution, who is responsible? Pipeline choices, AI ecosystems as initial community concerns. We've done a lot of work on the various participants in AI ecosystems, AI pipelines, and it's become very clear to us that particularly those who are at the lower levels of the power hierarchy in big organizations, big tech companies, even smaller consultancies involved in AI development, they are less likely to be able to have the luxury to engage with ethics because of external pressures like the market, like the client, like price concerns and costs. And so the question about who is responsible for exercising ethical decision-making is important. Firstly, the user, the data subject, responsible data use and management. Second, digital communities in which we all exist, chat groups and digital personal identity. We've got a project going on at the moment about safe social media for young people. How do we empower kids to take part in that control of their own personal identity and their safety? Significant others, very important. Our friends, our family, those at work that we trust. Then hierarchies, those above us, market imperatives and power asymmetries. Then the pipeline in which we might find ourselves. The AI ecosystem is a very good example of production pipelines in which decisions are made where ethics should be employed in those decisions. Media and information platforms, protecting safe content and policing responsible use. The state not to be left out, protecting against harm or punishing bad behavior. But to some extent, the role of the state is obviously limited in these situations because of the fact that law has lagged so far behind in the discussion of the regulation of AI and its governance. Finally, ethical AI is not about machines, as I've said before, but the use of tech and data. I can't make this point strongly enough. Ethics is about primarily the way in which we feed data into AI technology and the way in which we interpret it. Much discussion about bias and often the blame given to algorithms and to machines, when in fact the bias often reflects simply the bias that exists in the decision-making environment by humans. And that bias is translated. The machine learning process picks it up, exacerbates it, learns from it, learns from our bad behavior, and therefore the machine then is seen as the product of the problem. Digital self-determination fostering data subject autonomy. Think about this when you have time. We argue that an important part of our AI and community is to have data subjects aware of how their data is used and to be able to deal with it. I don't know how many of you use the delivery services for food or private hire vehicles, but all of those platform-based service deliveries produce secondary data through your transactions. And that secondary data then is sold on as data reuse into the data market, and you know nothing about it. Now that may not worry you if it's simply about the hamburger you bought or the trip you took to grandma, but it's much more important when we're dealing with things like the data that might be reused from a visit to the doctor. So the question about what data subjects know, how much they know, and how they should know it becomes key to ethical decision making, because to leave the data subject out of questions about ethical protection, ethical responsibility, means the data subject can't play any role at all in making sure that these decisions are accountable. Ethics and the importance of trust. This would take me till this time next week to effectively go through this issue. But trust is that word that rolls off people's tongues when they talk about ethics and AI. In China, in some autocratic states, trust isn't such a big deal. Social capital is based on whether the machine does something that benefits the citizen. But in countries that are concerned about rule of law, countries that are concerned about human rights, the issue of ethical principles generating trust becomes important. So design and deployment are issues that generate questions about trust inside and outside the lab. The work that we've been doing on trustworthy robotics has taken us into that realm and made us understand that many of the concerns of designers and those who are involved in the engineering and technological side are around safety and around risk. Important as these are, they're not then taken into the deployment phase, into the community outside the lab. So it's not sufficient just to have ethical principles only about questions of tech robustness. Now, trust is a choice initiated by the AI recipient. Trust is by not the robot, but by those who receive the robot's services. And often trust is built on the interpretation of risk and benefit. In many situations, this may be misunderstood. We may have seen too many sci-fi movies or taken misinformation from social media, which leads us to believe that the risks involved in trusting AI are in fact much greater than they are. We know this with autonomous vehicles, for example, that the likely risk to the passenger in autonomous vehicles is much less than that which would be the case by human-driven vehicles. But this isn't the way in which the majority of citizens believe. Their trust is built on other understandings. Trust is a multi-layered and dynamic concept influenced by internal predispositions and external contextual interpretations. Now, I've talked to many people who are involved in standardization, and I'm a great believer that standards are important, but not sufficient. Because as we've seen with the vaccines and the virus, that we can have some of the best standardization, best tests in place, and yet people will still refuse to believe in the standardization. So we've got to move trust into the community to deal with information, whether it's soundly based or not. We also should ask, what is the situation when AI is deployed? Who should be impacted by and benefited by AI and data use? So the question about AI and community comes back again. The Kampong spirit. The Kampong spirit really is a concept that grew up in the Straits territories. It's an idea about community and solidarity, which grew from the Kampong community historical heritage. Grace Fu, the Minister for Culture, Community and Youth, recently said Singapore's distinctive cultural heritage is the anchor of national identity. At the heart of it, community ownership and active participation are key to its sustainability. Whether it's Kampong or whether it's any other form of community-based, neighbourhood-based concept of solidarity and sustainability, this is something which is very keenly understood within the Asian context. And even in present day community consciousness, sustainability is constantly referred back, particularly in Singapore, to what they call Kampong conversations, where participants feel supported to build resilient and adaptable community arrangements in which they can live. So how does AI fit within that Kampong spirit, and where does ethics sit? Kampong ethics. In Kampong thinking, ethical decision-making is geared towards and inspired by a spirit of togetherness. So although we don't unpack the contentions about Kampong, and there are many, many criticisms of it, just using the concept in a positive notion, the idea of togetherness, solidarity, the question is, where does ethics sit? Now, this sentiment of solidarity, as I said, grew out of the Straits colonies and their history, but it's about local communities situated today within wider global communities and the interoperativeness of local, global, virtual, and actual. We transfer it through so many different communities in our daily living that the question of community for us is much more diverse and complex than it might have been in the days when people were living in a kampong on the river somewhere in the Malay Peninsula. Community as ethics locus, stories about ethics. Local physical communities bleed into online non-territorial communities, as I've referenced to before, and therefore we're asking questions about how does social bonding occur in actual communities, in virtual communities, and where does AI sit as part of that bonding process? Online environments call for a creative and different approach to regulating and maximizing the impacts of AI technology on people across various externalities. I really would like us, if we had time, to think about that. Where does ethics sit within online communities that are not ruled in the same way that communities are in the physical realm by laws, by regulations that have rooted themselves in material relationships? But the question of personality created in and around our digital data, the data personality that we develop, how is AI and ethics translated into that process so that people feel like they're involved in a situation that's governed by moral predisposition? The Kampong spirit of mutual support and solidarity tolerates the presence of reasonable pluralism in terms of a preferred model of community bonding. So we've got to have diversity as well as a recognition of cultural identity. And this is a great challenge when you're looking at issues of community inclusion. So as such, values like openness, equality, compassion, observed in Kampong context become fundamental to efforts in formulating a cohesive approach to AI governance and where ethics sits. Just on that point, interestingly, compassion is an ethical principle that arises in many Asian cultures. It has Buddhist roots, and it's strongly evocative of the way in which people believe that empathy, compassion should create relationships in business, in a social setting, in a variety of different locations where humans bond. And yet we don't see it in Western enunciations of ethics. Why not? Perhaps we could ask that question a little later. An Asian voice, I don't want to labor this, but it's an important point. And we've discussed this with many of our friends in the region. How do we avoid tokenism? How do we avoid descending into a situation where cultural relativity makes universal values impossible? We're not suggesting that. What we're suggesting is look at communities rather than difference, and try and see how communities embrace localized ethical and operational variations, and have different priorities about the way in which they want to see ethics applied. A very good example of this is the definition of fairness. Fairness exists in almost all ethical principle frameworks, and yet if you were to ask different communities about what fairness is, you'll get very different answers. And so should we simply ignore that and go back to some homogenous, external notion of fairness, or should we try and understand the fact that fairness has deep social roots? It's more constructive to consider which ethical approach is more effective in stimulating healthy social bonding. So in some situations, ethics, certain of the principles will become much more important. Questions of privacy are interesting in relation to this. If you talk to communities where privacy is less identified because private space is a luxury, then the concept of privacy moves more to something like integrity, the integrity of the message, the integrity of the data, rather than something that I can protect as a private right. And that's deeply cultural, deeply social, and it's a deeply relative. The work that we've done with young people on social media, for example, their concept of privacy is very much located in their circle of friends and their life, which is often quite limited in terms of their control over private space. But it's no less important to consider the way in which young people think about privacy. Now, how to maintain universal values and at the same time prioritize community preference? Big challenge. And it's where the work of cross-disciplinary scholars will come into play. I often wish that I was an anthropologist rather than a lawyer when it comes to questions like that. Back to why stories and storytelling is important. Humans and AI share life experience and will do more so with things like the deployment of AI into health service delivery. We now see AI largely managing digital finance. The world is now in a situation where the relationship between humans and AI-assisted technology and data use is everywhere and every moment. So we've got to ask ourselves, how do we understand that? What are the stories that make sense of it for us? The stories that we're talking about are a process of knowledge co-production. We learn more from the stories we make and the stories we share. And in this process of storytelling, there becomes a possibility, particularly in smart cities environments, not to find that we're overwhelmed by technology, but rather that we're in fact part of a relationship with tech, where tech becomes supportive rather than destructive of things like our human history, our oral history, our neighborhood experiences. Around that is the importance of life space and living engagements in community. We've had a big discussion in this area recently about how important neighborhoods have become after social isolation due to the pandemic. When people had the opportunity to come back together into physical communities, they left social media in a mass. There was a genuine desire to move back to a communitarian world in which stories were important. Stories give life, location, and legitimacy to ethical decision-making that embeds AI in community through trusted relationships where humans and AI share in achieving ethical priorities and personalities. In creating the story, we create our idea of what a moral priority is. And those moral priorities take on ethical form, and we construct our attitudes and our approaches, our relationships to AI and to the use of data-based technologies. Safe space for storytelling, I've told you pretty much about this already, but if you look at our work on digital self-determination, the idea of giving data subjects safe spaces in which they can manage their data is important. It becomes very important in the concept of urban development and smart cities, that residents are given room to develop social infrastructure, and so that they can have a say in the way in which their data is used and the way in which technology is designed to support what they consider to be the important aspects of their life experience. And also sustainability becomes important. And this is where the concept of open data becomes very, very significant. Open data can become an enabler of neighborhood interaction with new storytelling technologies and rejects relationships of unsustainable dependencies on tech. Just on that point very briefly, if we're going to use technology, AI-assisted information management, AI-assisted technology so that we can better curate, communicate, and converse with stories, it needs to be in a form which people can manage, understand, and deploy. If we do it through experts, if we do it through only the few that understand the intricacies of technology, then we create further unsustainable dependencies, which are in fact going to work against the importance of storytelling in relation to the development of sustainable urban space. Community, not commodified ethical values. We found in many respects the discussion about AI and ethics has been a discussion about how do you make data more accurate? How do you make data more, let's say, valuable because we put it through an ethical sieve? And therefore we go to the market with greater confidence in what we've done. Often I hear people who are AI creators saying things like, oh, well, we want ethical certification because it'll be great for our sales. This is not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is using ethics as part of a process of locating AI within the history of a community, within the growth of a neighborhood, within the situation of life spaces within urban development and smart cities. And to do that, you'll find that AI will take on a purpose that's driven not so much by the market, but rather driven by the communities in which AI is located. Community empowerment and deployment, I've largely touched on this already. And this is the point that I'd like to conclude on. Knowledge code production is sustainable in social infrastructure terms rather than economic development terms. But it can only happen if we have a recognition of the fact that AI needs to have at least a parallel purpose. And that parallel purpose is for the priorities that are determined by communities for social good. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. I must admit that I did not know the word Kampong before. It is in the German-speaking world is not so much known as in the English-speaking world, apparently. So this was fascinating also for me. Yes. So please, do you have any questions? There is a hand raised. Yes. So the first one was Mustafa Saket.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for a great talk. I learned a lot. Actually, I'm curious about that cultural relativism that you mentioned during your presentation, and the compromises between the universal values and the cultural relativism or cultural values in some Asian countries, Asian contexts. Do you see the cultural, I'm curious to know that your opinion about the cultural relativism of the contextual interpretation of universal values. Do you believe this is work in the AI ethics or not?
Yes, I think that's an excellent question, because I've presented something in a very oversimplified way, and that is that if we're talking about cultural relativity, there's two issues that immediately require greater consideration. One is, what do we mean by culture? And the second is, what do we mean by relativity? Now, in trying to determine a credible rather than a tokenistic approach to cultural definitions, I think we have to do what we're suggesting, which is move down to a very localized consideration of what communities think, rather than what states think or what regions think. And this is very important because in the work that we've done, for example, on trying to understand the way that communities or citizens react to the COVID control measures, it's become very clear in the work that we've done there that in different cultures, the reactions have been extremely different based on different priorities. China is a very good example where social capital is largely based on utility. It's not based on, concepts of rights or, determinations of the government keeping up ethical standards of any particular type. Now, in me saying that, I can only determine that from very secondhand information. I'm not Chinese and I haven't lived in that experience, but I can distill as much as I need for the argument. But the other part of what you're saying is very important. Do we simply sacrifice universal values because we're looking at relativity? No, we don't. But if you look at most ethical values, they are so broad that they require location. They require definition. So if we want to know what fairness is, if we want to know what the prevention of harm is, if we want to know what concepts of privacy are, you can't possibly do that simply by saying they're all the same. They're not. And so what I would advocate is, on the one hand, an acceptance of the importance of universal values, but on the other hand, a genuine exercise in the project of determining the meaning of those universal values against cultural reality, community reality.
Okay, next one is Christian Jeffrey.
Yes, Mark, thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. Thank you so much for this enlightening talk, which was very rich, as always. And I would have a lot of questions, but maybe I would like to follow up in this topic of cultural relativism, because you also termed it as being very important. So maybe my first question was, in the analysis of Kampong, of this Kampong spirit, did you find any tension or maybe impulses for the international debate where you say, here is something that maybe we would like to feed back, or where there is a kind of tension that is interesting and that we can report to the international debate? So what prompted you to talk about actually the difficulty between universal and local or regional standards? And secondly, I would like to push you a little bit on the on your reasoning in order to take account particular standards, so particularity. Couldn't we also make a general argument, because you said in a way this follows from the fact that we have to specify general values, but couldn't you also make a general argument that to a certain extent we need to adapt and we need also processes to adapt general values to local circumstances? So you could also, that would be my in a way proposition to you. Isn't there a kind of rule or universal principle that actually also calls for that?
Absolutely. I would expect no less from you, Christian, and then your questions could keep me here until the end of the evening. I'll try and keep my answers as brief as I can. I didn't talk about the dark side of Kampong. Kampong has many critics who say that it was paternalist and it was misogynist and it had many other issues that you might raise. And also, Kampongs were made up of generation gaps and were made up of people of different languages and different sexual predispositions. There were good people and bad people, and so the ideal does have some requirement to unpack. But if I was trying to take the core of Kampong for me that we've been trying to understand in the transition from Singapore in the days when it was just a little village to where it's now the exemplar of a smart city is the concept of solidarity, the idea of togetherness. Now that goes back to Sun Yat-sen's notion of and I'm a great fan of Sun Yat-sen's thinking, Sun Yat-sen's concept of brotherhood. I'm sure if Sun Yat-sen was around today, he'd call it sisterhood, but certainly the idea of togetherness, universality, drawing together, solidarity. And I think that's been very heavily missing in a lot of the debate about ethics. Ethics is seen as this sort of individualist exercise. You know, am I protected from the robot? Do I have a course of action against an unethical decision? A very sort of Western way of thinking about this. And I don't say that that's bad, but I just believe also that it's important that we try and wrestle a bit more with the idea that ethics has a community existence, whatever that community existence might be. Now, to the idea of universal values and whether in fact universal values still require enunciation at the same time we can talk about relativity, I have great reservations about cultural relativity because some of the greatest advances in the protection of the safety of women and children through UN conventions has come about by the UN saying we are not going to accept the cultural relativity argument. We're not going to say that some women in some parts of the world are unsafe because their culture allows their husbands to beat them, whereas in other cultures they're not allowed to do that. So there is this idea of a global community and global ethics and global responsibilities. I don't think we can shy away from that, and I think sometimes there might need to be a corrective exercise in moving into communities in order to deal with particular ways of thinking. I've thought about this very much when you talk about Asian business ethics, because Asian business ethics are very different from Asian family ethics or Asian community ethics. And there's been a lot of discussion, certainly in the Asian region, about whether in fact we need to cast a critical eye on the way in which principle is used in the business environment in Asian communities. And should there be a reflection, for example, back to a more general idea of business human rights or business ethics. I think this is a wonderful area of the tension between the local and the global. And I think it's a great opportunity for all disciplines to come together, for lawyers to listen to moral philosophers, for moral philosophers to listen to lawyers. And see what we can come up with. But I think it's a struggle worth having. And I have a feeling that there's not been enough coming from the community-based voice. There's too much a discussion about refining ethics at the top end, rather than making ethics real to people who are living in community environments.
Here's a question in the chat that maybe relates to that. How would a data governance model for AI look like if community were a central actor?
Well, the answer to that is it would look very different, because you would be removing the power to determine what were the rules from the experts and the managers and the company executives and the politicians and the priests and whoever else you want to give a power role to, down to people in community arrangements. Now, I don't think that that's a revolution. I don't think we're just turning around and saying, like the populists would, oh, well, the elite should be, you know, thrown in the river and the rest of us should rule. I don't believe that at all. What I believe is that there is a communion of spirits of let's say, goodwill that can be generated from both directions. This comes about particularly if you look at many of the jurisdictions that promote smart cities. Most smart cities are promoted on the philosophy of citizen-centric governance. Now, I would believe that 99.9% of those politicians who say that don't believe it. because they're not going to be about turning their power and their influence into the hands of the populace. But I think I could give you a very good example to that questioner. In Singapore, there has been an extensive rollout of sensors, infrared sensors, into public housing estates as a protective measure in many instances. But they've been received in quite a mixed way, largely because the rollout was a paternal process. And there wasn't enough time taken to ask whether grandma was comfortable having a sensor in the bathroom. Now, I think that these are pretty simple stories that if we were to move the governance frame so that we had a flatter power base, then we might be closer to a better governance arrangement. And I can take this out of the area of speculation and put it specifically into an application that makes sense to us. If you talk to people in the AI ecosystem who are in the low levels, the low ladders of power, they will say, we have no time to think about ethics. It doesn't mean that we're not ethical, but we've got our manager, we've got our team leader, we've got X, Y, and Z all telling us to get this done by this time, do this, do that, do something else. And so it becomes something which is profoundly dependent on externalities. And if there isn't a genuine attempt to communicate and to reduce these blockages and blind spots in the ethical ecosystem, then we're going to find that AI is going to be still discussed in ethical terms, largely in the boardroom.
Yeah, thank you very much for that elaboration. So we have Vivek Nalur.
Hi.
Yes.
Thank you very much for that talk. I have to say it resonated very much with me because I'm a computer scientist who works in this area. And whenever I talk to my students, we were discussing that Indian ethics sort of are transmitted in the same way, the way that you mentioned about storytelling. Mythology essentially tries to transmit virtuous behavior and how to deal with different situations. And the question that is in my mind, science, well, because of storytelling way of presenting ethical decision, depending on who is telling the story and what characters' perspectives being taken, you come up with different answers. Now, this has been convenient, evolution speaking, because as societies change over time, you can take different scientific perspective. From a technologist's perspective, this is very worrying because, at least in computer science, we understand that there is one truth. There is one correct answer. And so if I build a system that understands only one correct answer, then I'm wondering whether you think, A, do you agree that the fact that stories that are told differently come up with different principles? And if they do, then this mechanism cannot be translated in a technological infrastructure because most technology is based in the scientific path, one correct answer.
Okay. Let me just suggest that, in fact, that's the perfect place it should be, because there is this terrible divide between the lab and the community, between the engineer and the technology community and the community who receives the product. And I've talked to many engineers and computer scientists who are largely interested in ethics and are largely interested in somebody making it clear to them what they should comply with, so in a language they can understand, so that they can get on with doing it rather than being caught out. But they then can't look past safety, robustness, and risk. And so if you get your robot or your technology to be safe and to be robust and to be risk-free, and you introduce it to the community doesn't like it. And they say, the engineer says, well, I don't understand. This doesn't make any sense to me. This is the best robot in town. And I can tell a story to that person about how and why it happened. And if they are willing to listen, one of the problems with the storytelling analogy is that it requires not just democratic storytelling, so we can all tell stories. It's not just, you know, the advocate or the techie or whatever. We've got to talk in a language that we understand. So that's the first problem. But the second is we can all tell a story. But the third problem is we have to get our fingers out of our ears and we have to listen to that story and don't simply dismiss it on the basis of the fact that, oh, I don't understand that. And I think there's a lot of work to be done by those who promote ethics and those who promote an ethical best practice to getting a common language, to getting across that divide where the technician says, well, I understand talking to a technician, but don't understand talking to you. And certainly by talking in very general terms about things like fairness, explainability, you talk to an algorithm designer about explainability, they'll laugh at you. But I can talk to an algorithm designer about, you can explain to me how that algorithm makes a decision. What decision does it make? I don't need to be a mathematician. I don't need to know that. And so the story is something which can be in the hands of anyone, dependent on the fact that they're firstly willing to listen to other people's stories and they're willing to be surprised by them. I think that's the best answer I can give you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are out of time. We had a few questions in the chat again, but I think you covered them already. So yeah, let me thank you very much for this elaboration on Kampong ethics and what role AI, what the role of Kampong ethics for AI would be. I think this is just the beginning of this discussion, and I'm looking very much forward to continuing it. So again, let me close this by saying that our Responsible AI Forum, our big event, will take place at the Holiday Inn Munich City Center from 6 December to 8 December. So less than a month until then. Our 3-day event will bring together members of industry, civil society, government and academia to discuss the most relevant and pressing issues related to the responsible use of AI through shared stories. Mark, yours would be one, cutting edge research and practical applications. So please check our IEAI website and get your tickets soon. Last but not least, I want to remind you that the best way to stay up to date with our news and events is to visit our website, subscribe to our newsletter, and follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter. I would like to thank once again you, Mark, for accepting our invitation, and all of you for joining us and contributing to the discussion with your questions, comments, and remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed.